So we are discussing the first one, which is freedom from the first type of clinging that says if you cling to this life, you're not a practitioner. To overcome clinging to this life, it is important to reflect in a particular way that will allow us to generate the antidote for that. And the way to generate the antidote is that we reflect on the type of physical basis that we have attained right now, the precious human rebirth that we have. First of all, we contemplate that this type of rebirth is greatly meaningful. Secondly, that it is rare to find. And thirdly, that although it is so powerful, so meaningful, and so rare to find, once we find it, it does not remain for long, but instead it deteriorates. So we need to contemplate on impermanence. Once we contemplate on these three subjects, we are capable of generating some antidote that will allow us to pacify or eliminate at least coarse aspects of clinging into these lives. Okay, so whilst we're doing this, we are, in order to reflect on the precious human rebirth, we're looking at the features of this precious human rebirth. And we say that it is characterized by 8 freedoms and 10 endowments. In our last class, we began presenting the 8 freedoms, which we say is freedom from 8 oppressive situations. And once we have the freedom, we have leisure to practice Dharma. And then following that, we have the 10 endowments. The 10 endowments are broken down into 2 categories. 5 endowments that come from ourselves, and this is something that we covered in our previous class, and also 5 endowments that are provided from others. So just to briefly enumerate and explain those 5 endowments that come from others, based on Master Asanga's the Shravaka levels, the verse says that the Buddha has come, he taught the Dharma, the teachings remain, there are those who follow the teachings, and there is caring for others. So these are the 5 endowments that come from others. The first one is that the Buddha has come into this world. Secondly, that the Buddha has given instructions. Now, if we look into our situation, we have not accumulated the karma to directly meet with the supreme emanation of the Buddha and to directly hear advice and instructions from the supreme emanation. However, instead of that, what we have in our case is we have the opportunity to meet with our root teacher and other holy beings who teach the Dharma, and also we have the opportunity to hear, to listen, to receive the Dharma from them. So although we do not have the 2 original ones in the list, we have alternatives for the first 2. The third one is that the teachings remain for a long time. The fourth one is that we personally have engaged and followed those teachings. And the fifth one is that others are very caring and supportive. So, for example, out of generosity, there are sponsors who support us in our practice. So in that sense, we can say that we have the 5 endowments that come from others. So in our case, in this life, actually, we have the full set of all the freedoms and all the endowments. And in that sense, if we contemplate how much we have, we can see that this type of precious human rebirth is very powerful. As they say, it surpasses a wish-fulfilling jewel. So let's look at this wish-fulfilling jewel. The idea is that there is a jewel that is very rare and very precious, it's very powerful. If you put it on the top of a banner and you make prayers, whatever you request, that wish-fulfilling jewel will provide for you. However, we say that this precious human rebirth is something which is more powerful than a wish-fulfilling jewel. And the reason for that is because the wish-fulfilling jewel, or something I mean, you can see it as an analogy, let's say unlimited resources or the power to give you anything, right? Is something that only provides for the wishes or the desires of this life. It doesn't go beyond this life. It cannot provide you with something beyond this life. And therefore, the wish fulfilling jewel is not capable of providing for you a higher rebirth as a god or a human, or the definite goodness of liberation and omniscience. That's why we say the precious human rebirth is more important than the wish fulfilling jewel. So the way that we contemplate how it is greatly meaningful, the precious human rebirth is greatly meaningful, is by considering that by relying on it, we can obtain the immediate benefit, and also we can obtain far-fetching future benefits. So in the context of cultivating how it can give us immediate benefit. So we say that we have come into this life with a precious human rebirth. This is a type of result. This result has come about because in our previous life, we practice the main cause for obtaining this type of rebirth, which is morality. On the basis of morality in our past lives, we achieved the type of human rebirth that we have in this life. So again, this is something that having obtained a human life, we can consider that if I want to have another good rebirth in my next life, on the basis of this life, I can practice ethics. It's within my capacity. Then again, practicing ethics is the main cause for obtaining a human rebirth. But there is a possibility that although you're born as a human, you are lacking resources. You're born in poverty. But to overcome this, in this life, we can practice generosity. And as a result of practicing generosity in this life, in the future, we will have access to wealth and resources without having to experience poverty. Another feature that will be very useful in our next life is to always have good friends and companions and a team to support us. And this comes as a result of practicing patience in this life. Lesson. So, further, if we look in the Lamrim, it clearly says that in order to be able to practice Dharma, it is impossible. It is very important that we are humans that have certain characteristics. And to have these characteristics, we must gather or we must establish the causes. So when we say we obtain a type of rebirth that allows us to practice Dharma, the characteristics that we need to establish is the 8 maturational results and also the 7 qualities of a higher rebirth. So we will go through the list of the 8 maturational results. The first one is to have a long life. The second one is to have good physique. The third one is to be born in a good lineage, good family. The third one is to have great power, and this actually refers to resources, having wealth and resources. The next one, the fifth one, is to have trustworthy speech, because that means that whatever we say when we talk to others will be accepted as a truth. People will not doubt our speech. The sixth one is to be renowned as a great power. The seventh one is to be born as a male. The eighth one is to have great strength to practice the Dharma. And we will see that from this list, we actually have most, if not all, of the items in the list. If we look at the list of the 7 qualities of higher rebirth, you will see actually the list contains a few items that overlap with the previous list. So we have long life, good health, good physique, great resources, great lineage, great power and excellent knowledge. So what is different perhaps in this list is the excellent knowledge. That's the additional thing. We need to consider again and again how we have obtained a type of rebirth that fulfills all these lists. It has all of these characteristics, and in that sense is extremely powerful, can give us the immediate results. Also, we can consider how on the basis of this life, this type of rebirth, we can obtain all the future far-fetching results, and this refers to obtaining liberation and the omniscient state of Buddhahood. So on the basis of this life, we can actually obtain all those things. And even if we engage in the practice of Tantra, we can reach a state of Buddhahood in one life and one body. And this definitely is an indication of the might and the power of this type of rebirth that we have. So these are things that we need to contemplate repeatedly. That's all. Okay, so we have talked about how meaningful this type of precious human rebirth that we have is. Although it is meaningful and it is greatly powerful, it is not a type of rebirth that is easily found. What we enjoy right now is something which is very rare. It is very rare to find because, as we said, the foundation is to have pure ethics that abandon the 10 non-virtuous actions. In addition to that, aiding or adding to that, we must engage in the practice of the 6 perfections. And finally, we must couple all this with stainless prayers. So it is because it requires those things in order to obtain it, it is far more difficult to find it than finding other types of rebirth. The rarity of finding the precious human rebirth is presented under 3 subject topics. The first one, it is difficult to find due to the cause. The second one, it is difficult to find, and this is presented through examples. And the third one, it is difficult to find due to its nature. The first one, this type of rebirth is difficult to find due to its causes, is exactly what we mentioned here. It requires these causes that are many and are difficult to establish. First of all, pure ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtuous actions. Secondly, engaging in the practice of the 6 perfections. Thirdly, making stainless prayers. Stainless prayers here are the prayers that we make to be reborn with this type of precious human rebirth again and again. And stainless here means that it is not stained by the attachment or the clinging to this life. So from the point of view of causes, it's difficult to obtain. Lesson. Then we come to the second topic, which is looking at how this type of precious rebirth is rare from the point of view of examples. So if you look at the Lamrim, usually there are 2 types of examples. The first example that is mentioned there is the example of the grass growing on the rooftop. So although it is possible to have grass growing on the rooftop, the top of a building, if you compare the grass that grows on the top of a building with the grass that grows on the ground in valleys, in the fields and so forth, in comparison, there's much more grass growing down on the ground in the valleys, isn't it? So the grass on the top of the roof is very limited. Similarly, when we look at the precious human rebirth, those who have this type of rebirth are very few compared to other types of migrations. Although in general, when we look at the population of humans in this earth, we keep saying, the population is increasing. Or, for example, you can look at a country like India. It looks, crowded, very well populated with humans. However, if we compare the number of the population of humans to the population of other species, such as, for example, if we look at animals, and in particular, if we look at insects, if you look at ants, for example, like the population of ants far exceeds the population of humans, even in places where the place is crowded by humans, right? So, in comparison to other types of rebirth, the human rebirth is has a small number. If we continue and we see how difficult it is in terms of its nature, we say that in order to establish a precious human rebirth, it is important that we practice virtue. We stress again and again that the main cause is ethics, is morality. And that actually indicates that we must put great effort in engaging the 10 virtuous actions. Engaging in virtue does not come naturally to us. It's not our natural behavior, our natural response. We come into this life with many imprints of non-virtue from our previous lives, and therefore engaging in non-virtue is almost like our automatic response. It comes easily. We don't have to put effort in engaging in non-virtue. But on the other hand, it takes quite a lot of effort, a lot of discipline to make ourselves engage in virtue. To give you an example, you might come into the center to participate in a puja or prayers or whatever. So you have to set your motivation and say, I will do this to benefit others, and then practice accordingly for the duration of this activity, let's say a couple of hours. And you see that it does take discipline, it does take effort to come and set your motivation and participate and do the prayers properly. And then after those 2 hours are finished, which are your 2 hours of virtue, you walk away from the center, and then suddenly the day is finished, right? You are distracted, and you're thinking, oh, where did the last 2 or 3 hours go? What did I do the last 2, 3 hours? When you are distracted, you actually fall under the sway of non-virtuous activities. So this actually indicates how easily we slip into non-virtue without having to think about it, and how difficult it is to engage in virtue. So we have obtained this type of precious human rebirth, which is very meaningful and very rare to find. However, although we have established it, it is not a type of rebirth that remains. And for that reason, the third thing that we have to contemplate is death and impermanence. So the subject of death and impermanence is presented in the Lamrim under 3 topics. The first one, the faults of not recollecting death. The second one is the benefits of recollecting death. And the third one is the actual way to meditate on death and impermanence. So first of all, let's talk about the faults of not remembering death. The first one is you will have no recollection of death. The second one, even if you do recall death, you will not practice. The third one, even if you practice, you will not practice properly. The fourth one, you will not be exact or meticulous with your practice. The fifth one is that you will engage in a lot of wrongdoing, because if you have this attitude of never thinking about death and your own impermanence, not thinking about the law of cause and effect, you sort of like you do whatever comes to mind, and your behavior will be a behavior full of mistakes. And the last one is that finally, with this type of attitude, having spent your life like this, when you come to the time of death, you will die with regret, because at that time, eventually, the question arises, what type of rebirth I will have after this? And it will be obvious to yourself that it can only be a rebirth in the lower migrations, and that brings regret. So these are the faults. That's all. Then the next thing is that we look the benefits of recollecting death, and basically it's the opposites of forgetting, never thinking about death. The first one is that recollection of death makes everything meaningful. It makes meaningful because although recollection of death initially might be sort of like an uncomfortable subject for you to keep in mind. Nevertheless, it reminds you, it brings up the thought in your mind that says, I should practice Dharma because I will die. There is death, right? And that makes you make a prayer to your root guru. It makes you remember the qualities of the Buddha and so forth. So it just makes you have the thought that I should practice Dharma. And in that sense, it's meaningful. That's the first benefit. The second one is that it is powerful. And powerful here, it means that it makes your practice of Dharma powerful because you remember of death. The next three characteristics is that it is important in the beginning, in the middle, and the end. So it is important in the beginning because recollection of death makes you engage or begin the Dharma practice. It is important in the middle because after you practice after you engage the practice, it keeps you motivated. And it is important at the end because having practice in this way vigorously and continuously, at the end, you will have the result of this practice. And the final conclusion of this, which is the last of the benefits, is that when the time of your death comes, you die happily, easily, meaning without having regrets. So if you have practiced like this the whole of your life, and then at one point you come sick, you go to the hospital, and the doctor says, look, there's nothing we can do. I have nothing to offer you in terms of treatment. At that time, your mind can think that I've done the best I could in my life. I have practiced, I have purified as much as I could, and now I do not have many regrets. So for me now, this death it will be like easily, joyfully, without much hardship, mental hardship to go through. As for the third subject, which is the actual way to meditate on death, this is done under three headings. First of all, that death is certain. The second one is that the actual time of death is uncertain. And the third one is that at the time of death, only Dharma can be of benefit. So we say that we contemplate it under three subjects. The first one is that death is certain. So death is certain, is inevitable. Everyone who has been born has to die. At the end of birth, they will be death. So I also will have to die. And what is the reason why we contemplate this? We contemplate this because then we consider, all right, so whilst I am alive, I can do something which is of benefit to others. I can do something good, something beneficial. So thinking that I will die should have the effect in your mind that says I should practice virtue. Even if we don't use the term virtue, establish virtue, just do something beneficial for others whilst you're still alive. It should bring up this thought. The second subject that we have to consider is that although it is certain that I will die, the actual time of my death is uncertain. All of us, we have this tendency to think that, yes, I understand I will die, but I will not die today, and I'm not going to die tomorrow. And what that makes us is procrastinate. So we have decided and we understand that we need to practice virtue, but we say, okay, there's no hurry because I'm not dying today, I'm not dying tomorrow. Whatever is this virtuous activity that needs to be doing, I can do it tomorrow. All right. So we all have this tendency. However, when we contemplate that the actual time of our death is uncertain, we don't know when death will strike, that changes things. We have this experience where There are many people that you see in the morning, and then they are not there in the evening. They have passed away. Or some people you see in the evening and they never rise, they're not alive the next day. So once we consider this, we say, oh, okay, there is this job or this Dharma activity that I should be doing. I better do it today because I don't know if I will be around tomorrow. So it makes you say, I will practice Dharma and I will practice it right away, right now. That's all. The third subject that we contemplate is that at the time of death, only Dharma can be of benefit. So things such as, for example, our money, our relationships, even our body that we have such close connection with, these are not things that we can carry with us. These things cannot be of any benefit. At the time of death, the consciousness separates from the body. So even the body cannot be of any benefit. So what is it that continues after death? If in this life we practice virtue, we create positive imprints, and those imprints, they will continue in the next life. So in the next life, we will experience the result of those positive imprints. Similarly, if we engage in negative activities, we create negative imprints. And these are the things that will follow us in the next life, and we will have to experience the unpleasant results of that. All of us wish to experience happiness, and especially we want to experience happiness in life after life after life. And if this is the case, what we need to do is to practice Dharma. No other thing can be of benefit in terms of what we carry in our next lives. So the money will not help, the body will not help, relatives, friends, and so forth can be of no benefit. So the third point is that I should only practice Dharma. That's all. So with this, we complete the presentation of the first section that addresses the verse that says, if you cling to this life, you are not a practitioner. And the way that we contemplate this is that by considering the type of body that we have established, that we have right now, how it is something which is greatly meaningful, how it is something which is very rare to find, and finally, how it is something that is impermanent. Once we consider this, we should definitely reach the conclusion that we do not want to waste this type of rebirth of body that we have right now. And we reach the conclusion that we must practice, and not just that we must practice Dharma in general, but we should practice it right away. We should not let any opportunity of practicing Dharma be wasted. But as we engage in practice, it is important that our practice does not come with attachment, with clinging to this life. As we explained in the first session, the best motivation when we engage in practice is I'm doing this practice in order to establish the causes so that I can become enlightened in order to benefit all sentient beings. If we cannot think in this way, maybe the second best way to think is I'm doing this practice in order to pacify and reduce my afflictions, or at the very least, we should say, I'm doing this practice so that I will avoid being reborn in the lower migrations and make sure that I will obtain a higher rebirth as a god or a human. That's all. Okay, so as we say, if we practice according to the instructions that are given to us through the first verse, we might engage in practice that does not cling to this life. However, we might have this idea that in my next life, I really want to be reborn as a god and a human. So the question is, does this become practiced? And the answer is yes, it is practice. However, it is not pure practice because there is still clinging onto certain types of rebirth in samsara. Although, of course, there is relative happiness in the higher rebirths as a god or a human, because still these are rebirths that are taken or established under the power of karma and afflictions, we cannot say that the happiness that they experience in this type of rebirth is pure or stable happiness. It is not stable happiness until you abandon karma and afflictions. If you're looking for stable, everlasting happiness, then you need to make effort to obtain the state of liberation. So if we continue and we look at the next verse, which is verse number 14, it says, to seek nirvana, the state beyond sorrow, relinquish clinging to the three realms. So if you're looking for liberation, the state that is completely free from any type of suffering, then you must give up your clinging for the three realms of existence. So how do you do this? To relinquish clinging to the three realms, reflect on the defects of cyclic existence. So what are the defects? What is the fault of cyclic existence? The fault of cyclic existence is that it is in the nature of suffering. So what we need to understand is that samsara is in the nature of suffering. And then from that point onwards, the practice again changes. So we need to contemplate the nature of samsara as being the nature of suffering. In the presentation according to the Lamrim, in that we have two sections. So we have the general contemplation on suffering, and then contemplating individual specific types of suffering. Then in the general contemplation of suffering, we have the presentation of the 8 types of suffering, the 6 types of suffering, and the 3 types of suffering. Although this is the presentation in the Lamrim, in this particular text, the presentation of suffering is presented on the basis of the 3 types of suffering. However, Geshe would like to present briefly the 8 types of suffering and the 6 types of suffering. So, in the general presentation of suffering, the 8 types of suffering are the suffering of birth, the suffering of old age, the suffering of illness, the suffering of death, the suffering of meeting with the unpleasant. So we do certain activities, and sometimes we come across things that we do not wish to experience. So when we meet with the unwished for, unpleasant, there is suffering involved in that. The next one is to be separated from the pleasant. We have things that we enjoy, that we want to continue being in contact with, and when we are separated from that, this brings the suffering of separation in our mind. The next one is not getting what we want. We engage in activities because we have certain goals. We are chasing after certain things. And when we cannot achieve them, when we cannot get them, there is the suffering of not getting what we're looking after. And finally, there is the suffering of the 5 appropriated aggregates. The nature of our 5 aggregates is that they are contaminated, appropriated aggregates. Therefore, they are in the nature of suffering. They will never give us a stable pleasure. The next list of suffering to contemplate are the 6 types of suffering. So we have, first of all, we reflect the uncertainty. Second, we reflect how we are never satiated. Third, we reflect how we repeatedly cast off the bodies. Next one, we reflect how repeatedly we have to take another rebirth. How the next one in the list, how we repeatedly descend from high status to a low status. And finally, we reflect how we have no companion. The way to think about the first one, reflecting uncertainty, is that Actually, right now, in this moment, we might experience some small happiness, some satisfaction, but there is no guarantee that tomorrow also we will have the similar experience, the similar level of satisfaction, or something more than this. So there is uncertainty. The second one is the lack of satisfaction. So it doesn't matter if we experience a small amount of happiness or we get something that we want. Actually, we're not satisfied and we want more. So imagine you give to a beggar a $10 note. And at this point, the person is happy the first time they receive the $10. They're happy because before they didn't have anything. So they're happy. But then in their mind arises the thought, I would like to have 10 more. I would like to have $20. Even if you give them $20, they will be thinking, I would like to have $30. So there is that sense that we are not satisfied, we're not satiated with whatever we receive. The next one is about casting off bodies repeatedly. So just consider that right now we have a body that is complete in all the limbs and we have all the senses and all the faculties complete. But every time we go through the process of rebirth, there is actually no guarantee that next time we will have a body with full senses, full faculties, and so forth. The next one is that we repeatedly will go through the process of death, so of taking rebirth. So until we abandon karma and affliction, we have no control of this process of having to take rebirth, uncontrollable rebirth, again and again. The next one is that repeatedly we fall from the high status to the low status. So you could be a king or you could be a millionaire, very rich person in this life. And then in your next life, you're born as a servant, as a beggar, and so forth. So again and again, this happens. And finally, the last type of suffering is that we have no companions in the moments that are really important in our lives. We have to go alone. We don't have companions. So very quickly, we have mentioned the list of the 8 and the 6 types of suffering. You can find those extensively in Lamrim Chenmo, but obviously here, because we have time constraint, we can only have just a brief mention, a brief presentation, and we cannot go into greater detail. Awesome. However, we can look at the presentation of the 3 types of suffering. The 3 types of suffering are the suffering of change, and pervasive compounded suffering. From these 3 types of suffering, the first one, the suffering of suffering, is something that we are aware of and certainly we recognize it. So, for example, you might eat a particular type of food that does not that does not agree with you, you don't digest it properly, and soon you have problems in your stomach, you feel uncomfortable, you might get sick. So we recognize that feeling of suffering, of pain, is really pain, right? Illness. We recognize this as being a type of suffering. And it is obvious that we recognize it because we pay so much attention to our food, to our health. We try to eat the right food, we try to maintain our health, and so forth. So this indicates that we recognize the first type of suffering as being suffering. However, the other 2 types of suffering, which is the suffering of suffering and the pervasive compounded suffering, we do not recognize them for what they are. So to talk about the suffering of change, or talk about it through an example. So you come into this room from outside. Outside is hot and sticky, and you come into the room, and in the room we have the air conditioning. So when you first enter the room, it is a very pleasant sensation, right? It is pleasure. You experience pleasure because you have stopped the suffering that came from the heat outside. But is this pure pleasure? So is remaining in an air-conditioned room pure pleasure? The answer to that is not, because the longer you stay in the air-conditioned room, or if the air conditioning goes up, you become colder and colder. So what started as a relief or as a pleasure actually turns into the suffering of being too cold. And this is what happens with every type of contaminated pleasure. Contaminated pleasure does not remain as pleasurable, but it changes into the nature of suffering. And we have the misconception that we hold incorrectly, we hold contaminated pleasures to be happiness, whilst in reality they are suffering. They are the suffering of change. As for the third type of suffering, which is the pervasive and compounded suffering, this really refers to the body that we have, right? Those aggregates that we have. And they are contaminated and they are in the nature of suffering. So, in order to generate proper renunciation from samsara, it says that it is very important that we generate renunciation towards, and we recognize the third type of suffering, the pervasive compounded suffering. So we continue with our text, and we see from verses 15 and 16, our verse identifies the first type of suffering, which is the suffering of suffering, in relation to the suffering of the three lower migrations. So again, this is an acceptable presentation. It says, first is the suffering of suffering. This includes the sufferings of the three lower realms. If you contemplate this well, fear will arise. For if ripen upon you, they are indeed unbearable. Not gathering the virtuous karma that overcomes this and continuing to cultivate the fields of lower realms, wherever such conduct exists, spit on it. Okay, so first is the suffering of suffering, which, as we say, it here is identified as the suffering of the three lower migrations, which is the hell beings, and there is suffering in the hot hells and the cold hells. Then we have the suffering of the hungry ghosts who suffer from hunger and thirst. And then we have the suffering of the animals who suffer from exploitation and lack of intelligence. So actually, as humans, we cannot directly see the hell beings or the hungry ghosts. So directly, we cannot experience their suffering. However, we can experience the suffering and the living conditions of the animals. And when we experience the suffering of the animals, we always have to contemplate. I mean, it's not to experience, it's not just to look at it as oh, look at how they suffer, but to consider, if I were to be reborn as such an animal, would I be able to bear that suffering? What would I do? Would I be able to tolerate it? So Geshe was saying, unfortunately, I had this experience where I saw that in certain restaurants, there are live animals who are captured, and then sort of like the patrons of the restaurant go there and they choose this particular animal. And then that animal has to be killed and skinned and cooked on the point in the restaurant. So Geshe was saying, okay, so when you experience something like this, you witness this suffering, you think, if I were to be reborn as such an animal in these conditions, how would it be for me? Would I be able to bear this? What would I do? So the idea, of course, is like great fear arises, but then you understand, how can I avoid such type of rebirth and suffering falling upon me in the future? There is a method, and the method is to abandon non-virtue and to practice as much virtue as possible. So whilst I understand, I'm intelligent enough to understand that the method for avoiding this type of suffering is to practice as much virtue as possible, if I continue acting with an ignorant sort of like attitude, creating non-virtue, So, well, this type of behavior, wherever such contact exists, spit on it. Meaning, spit on it actually means have great revulsion, like completely discard that thing. Okay. So we mentioned the health, the suffering of the health. We will not go into great detail here. However, if you look in the Lamrim, you will find this presentation. It's easy to follow. There are 18 types of hell altogether. We have hot hells, we had cold hells, we have occasional hells, and we have nearing hells. You can refer to those to this presentation. Okay, then we have the suffering of change, and the suffering of change is presented on the basis of human experiences. So we continue with the next one, which is the suffering of change, starting with verse 17 and continuing on to 18. Reflect on the suffering of change. From higher realms, you can fall to the lower realms. The god Indra can be reborn as a mere earthling. Sun and moon can turn into darkness. The universal monarch can be reborn as a servant. This can be known by means of scripture, but cannot be perceived by ordinary beings. So you could have a good rebirth. Let's say in this life you came as a human. However, in your past life, you might have created non-virtuous actions, and even during this good rebirth, you might engage in non-virtuous actions. And as a result of those non-virtuous actions, again, you will take another rebirth in the lower existence and there experience suffering. So we see a number of examples of great changes here. So we mentioned before that one of the types of suffering is the suffering of uncertainty and falling from the high to the low. So it begins with the example of God Indra, who is the king of the gods, can be reborn as a mere earthling because he has not abandoned karma and affliction. One rebirth, he's born as the king of the gods, and then in the next life is just an ordinary human being. Then the sun and the moon can turn into darkness. So, according to the mythology here or the presentation, the sun and the moon are gods, right? So, the sun is a god and the moon is a god. And they have bodies that are extremely brilliant. They are so brilliant, they illuminate light that reaches many leagues, right? But once after they change from this type of rebirth, they can be reborn in a place that is so dark that the eyes cannot perceive any object due to the thick darkness. Then it says the universal monarch can be reborn as a servant. So one minute you're an emperor, the next life you are a servant. Now, there are changes like this. Are they easy for us to understand? The answer is no. These can be known by means of scripture, but cannot be perceived by ordinary beings. So, although it is difficult for us or humans to actually experience these types of suffering, right? We cannot really perceive what is happening in the God realm. We cannot experience what is happening in the hell realms and so forth. Therefore, the text continues by saying, therefore, observe your own experience on human level changes. And it says, verse 19, a rich man turns into a poor man. A confident man changes into an anxious one. Okay, the next line needs some small correction. Many people are reduced to one. The list of such phenomena is inconceivable. So we see rich people who have all the resources becoming impoverished. We see here, as it says, a confident man. A confident man is someone who, with his or her speech, can actually control others or can influence a lot of other people. And we see that these people with such power of speech such control and power, they turn out to be very anxious, weak, insignificant. And then we might have a great gathering of people at one point, and then after a while we see that everybody has left and there's only one person left. So such differences, such changes, great changes occur, and these are things that we can actually witness. And when those inconceivable, incredible changes happen, these are an indication of us for the suffering of change on that level. We can reflect it in this way. Lasso. So we continue with the third type of suffering. In our text, we only have a short presentation starting from verse 20. If you reflect on the suffering of conditioning, karmic deeds are endless. You suffer with too much, you suffer with too little. You suffer if rich, you suffer if starved. We waste our entire lives in preparation. While in preparation, we all die. So it talks about conditioned suffering, conditioned suffering. And it says, our activities here are endless. The thing is that we do not recognize this, and that's the biggest problem here. So it says, whether we have too much or whether we have too little, nevertheless, we suffer. So you could be a multimillionaire person, you're still suffering. Or you could be the beggar, the homeless beggar who is starving and lying by the street. And again, that person is suffering. Because we do not understand this, we waste our entire life in preparations. So, although our life it's hard to last even for 100 years. I mean, these days the lifespan has increased. So definitely, let's say 80 years, or you could push it up to 90. There are people who live up to 100 years. The majority of people do not. However, if you see the preparations, the attitude we have when we make preparations, let's say you buy a piece of land or you buy a house, the thought that you have for this possession is that this will last for 1,000 years, for many generations to come, right? So you're thinking for things that you want to last far longer than your own life. And we keep doing, not understanding that death will come, impermanence is there. So we keep engaging in activities. So let me prepare this, let me organize this. And as we do this, the whole life is wasted in this preparation. And while in preparation, we will die. And then it says, even in death, there is no end to preparations, for we begin preparations for the next life. So those who completely do not understand cannot think about these issues and remain ignorant, and their behavior is driven by this ignorance. So it says, spit on those who continue to cling to this mass of suffering called cyclic existence. So this the second line that we have that says, if you cling to the three realms, that is not renunciation. Very important to consider the different types of suffering and generate the mind of renunciation, of definite emergence. And as Jay Rinpoche says, in order to generate the mind of renunciation, you need to contemplate repeatedly again and again the law of cause and effect, the consequences of various karmic activities, and come to the point of not having any attachment whatsoever for any state of rebirth in cyclic existence. So when you have that, then you generate the mind that wishes for liberation. So this instruction from Jay Rinpoche is summarized here with the second line of the core instruction. If you cling to the three realms, that is not renunciation. Lasso. Okay, so maybe questions related to this text. If you have any thoughts, any doubts about this text, this presentation, let us know.
Geshe, thank you for your teaching. Okay, I have a question regarding what was being taught. You mentioned that about the precious human rebirth, that, you know, the main reason why we are able to practice is because of ethics, perfections, and stainless prayers. I have a question regarding the animal rebirth. Okay, because animals, they do not have intelligence and they have bad karma. They do not have any lack of ethics, so they are not able to transcend their rebirth into human. Is it difficult or almost impossible for them to ever gain human rebirth? If let's say the animal, let's say if dogs, right? For example, if there's a stray dog and a pet dog, the pet dog will, the way I see it is that likelihood he or she would have a higher chance of a human rebirth because the conditions are better. There is less aggression, there is less insecurity compared to a stray dog. Would we see that way that probably a pet dog can exhaust the karma faster because he or she is reborn in a better condition than a dog who is on the street? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the question is about, okay, we have seen the causes for the precious human rebirth. Another main question is about the animals because they lack the intelligence, they cannot practice ethics. So is it possible for an animal to overcome that animal rebirth and be reborn again as a human? And then if we take the example of a dog, between a stray dog and a pet dog, perhaps the pet dog is born in better conditions, can exhaust the negative karma easier, has better chances to be reborn as a human because it will have less aggression, less dog fights, and so forth. Yes? So, very good question. And actually, it is something that the Buddha himself has mentioned. So the important thing is really at any cost, try to avoid to fall into any of the lower migrations because once you fall there, it is very hard to be reborn again as a human. The Buddha has explained this through an example, and he says, the number of beings who fall from a higher migration into a lower migration are as many as the grains of sand in the earth. So, a very vast number. Whilst the number of those who rise from a lower migration to a good rebirth are as few as the grains of sand that are caught under your fingernail. So a very small number. And this indicates that it is very difficult to actually rise up. And the difficulty, the reason for that is the causes. We have to look at the causes. As we said before, it is actually very easy to engage in the 10 non-virtuous actions. No one needs to instruct us. Naturally, we navigate towards the 10 non-virtuous actions. When it comes to engaging the 10 virtuous actions, first of all, someone has to instruct us, say you should do this and this and this. And this is not enough. This is not sufficient to hear the advice. From our side, we have to make the effort. And then again, that is not enough because if you make the effort today, but you lapse again tomorrow, it's of no benefit. So you need to have effort and then you need to have continuity. So it is quite difficult. So it goes, it is according to the causes. And then you gave this example of the stray dog and the pet dog, which again is a very good case of study in terms of karma. Because you see, the stray dogs, there is no one to take care of them, there's no one to provide for them. Resources are very scarce, their living conditions are very poor. In comparison, the pet dogs that we keep in our houses have everything provided for them. They have the best food, sometimes the same food that the humans eat, and their living conditions, like the bed and what have you, is in some cases much better than the living conditions of many humans out there. So think, what has made this pet dog experience this condition? What did they do in their past lives? In their past lives, they must have practiced generosity, and the maturational result of that generosity of past life is experienced in this life as having everything provided for them: the food, the accommodation, the soft bed, everything. But in their past lives, they didn't practice ethics, they didn't practice morality. And the maturational result of not practicing morality is that they were born as a dog, as an animal, a lower type of rebirth. So there's a lot to consider about karma and its result. Okay, so Geshe was saying actually we will talk about the law of cause and effect tomorrow. Geshe will talk about virtuous and non-virtuous actions bringing about the three types of results. So if we will talk about it tomorrow.